Oh, I want to start back with our good buddy, Lewis Henry Morgan. We've talked about the underlying assumptions that Boas was fighting against the Lewis Henry Morgan idea of the lines of human progress from savagery through barbarism to civilization, and the often racially charged notion of that, which became very prominent, is still around today. And back then, one of you brought up that Lewis Henry Morgan also had this idea that in the olden days, in the very old days, probably in that savagery stage, there was generalized promiscuity, group marriage, everybody's sleeping together, and that you have this progression in society as you get more and more civilized toward the monogamous family unit. And so he wrote the book called Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family. Consanguinity meaning blood relationships, sanguineous, and affinity meaning relationships by marriage. And again, the idea is of a progression. And if people had different systems, then they were somewhere off the progressive line. I noted earlier that Friedrich Engels, the buddy of Karl Marx, borrowed from Lewis Henry Morgan a lot for his book, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And of course, the goal of Engels was to actually abolish family, private property in the state and the new revolution, which would get rid of those things. But Lewis Henry Morgan was used on the left, people who saw this as something to be superseded, but also was used on the political right, obviously, the idea that everything progressed toward monogamy and more perfect union. And it became very common, and I'm actually beginning at a place where none of you commented on, perhaps because it's the very end of the chapter. We're going to begin in the kinship part, and then we're going to go back into the marriage part. So we're first going to talk about kinship. Of course, these are related to each other, but kinship is in how we reckon our descent. And basically, kinship also tells us the rules about who we can and can't marry. So you may have seen a chart like this in maybe an ancestry site or something like that. This is known as a kind of typical kinship symbols and terminologies, but it's really anthropology, as Gonzalez puts it on page 160, was one of probably the foremost disciplines to develop the symbols and the different ideas about trying to chart people's kinship. As she puts it, much early ethnographic fieldwork focused on constructing accurate kinship charts in order to understand the kin-related reasons for social patterns. So the idea was you could send out, or you could do these surveys and try to figure out who was related to whom and who called somebody what to each other, and get these descent lines, and then you could kind of track what was going on in a society. So I want us to try this out for ourselves. You have to start with ego, but I am recruiting someone from YouTube who will give us a little primer, another anthropologist who will give us a primer in how to do this. I have to see if my... Okay, that's pretty good practice. Basically, one of the things I want to talk about is the issues that come up with these. Liam's mentioned one of the issues, which is too many. What other issues potentially come up. Things that are hard to do or hard to represent. Yes.
So my uncle got married and she had children with another guy, but now they're also technically a part of the family, but they're not like from anyone in my family. So there's that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess one of the things I want to say is this stuff works on the assumption that people have these very standard sort of cookie cutter relationships, right? And the complexities of life, even perhaps someone like Margaret Mead's life, as we'll read about, are even back in the day, these kind of were good for if you assumed everybody had very simple relationships. And the more things that happened, the stranger they got, right? And so, and if you think about an anthropologist trying to do these charts with in another language, there were probably a lot of simplifications that were made. If we can't even do them in our own language, what else do we run into? Did you so uh-huh.
It's just kind of really messy and I don't know everyone in my family.
It's yeah, I mean these things they're pretty complicated because families are complicated and families are messy. And so to do this is it's often a very idealized form of things. And I think you were correct to give our instructor, our guest instructor, a hard time. I really like her, but when she said, what'd she say? He didn't have any kids. He didn't marry anybody. He didn't have anybody. It's the assumption that you have to have somebody, right? Yes.
Yeah, my grandfather has a sibling. He has a brother, but he never talked to that brother. So, like, I don't know if we're dealing like biologically or like culture, like family wise, like he's not really part of this part of the family that like would count him or
Yeah, I mean, this is a hugely important point, is that the people that we are biologically related to are not necessarily the people that we feel close to, or that we even feel should be part of the family. And so, we can sometimes do the relationships, but it doesn't really tell you about the relationships. Yes. Yeah.
Like how would you represent adoption?
Yeah, adoption, which happens all over the world, right? And I mean, oftentimes that's just incorporated in and you never know. And so, it's another complexity that often gets left out of this. There's something else about these symbols too. I mean, and bless you. And as our guest instructor did it, and I'm a girl, so I'll do this, and here's my husband. I mean, it's pretty heteronormative. It's pretty gendered, and it's pretty based on, triangles and circles, except for this square. So I say this to talk about, what the early anthropologists, people like Lewis Henry Morgan, got really into kinship. And what they thought they were going, what they believed about the world is that the world came in triangles and circles, and that triangles and circles got together. And if you didn't get together, then you had nobody. That was not so what we would call today heteronormativity. That biologically speaking, this should be the thing that happened. So that was what they thought they were finding or thought they would find. And they believed, as we talked about, that there was this sort of directionality to things, that as societies progressed, as we got more sophisticated, that we became more, our kinship terms became more correct or more in line talked about as evolutionism. And they assumed that there were a hierarchy of forms about how people related to each other. What did they find? What did they find out there? What do we see out there, Juliana, if we survey the world? What do we see out there?
Like there's different
Yeah, we see lots of different things. We see a lot of different kinds of ways that people make kin, make marriages, do things in the world. And so the biology, obviously biology is important. We don't want to neglect that people have brothers and people have sisters and people have others, but that doesn't necessarily determine the kinds of families that they are going to form and the kinds of kinship they're going to bond. Again, evolution as in change over time, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone is moving in a certain direction. And so, yes, people change their ideas over time, think about them, talk about them, consider alternatives, but the changes they make are not necessarily the direction that we'd always anticipate. And that there's lots of different ways that we could do things. There's lots of workable ideas. Of course, that doesn't mean that all the ideas are great or they work all the time. It doesn't mean that we want to espouse or get too into one of these ideas, either our own or somebody else's. But the point is to sort of think about other ideas that might be out there. So a lot of, like I said, the early anthropologists got so into kinship that it was joked funny. That they got so into this that it was said that anthropology actually should be called kinshipology, because in the old days, this would be like chapter 1 of the book, where you talk about all the different forms of kinship and how different people reckon their kin and the forms of marriage and those things, because people really believed this was the key to unlocking social organization, especially in societies outside of the modern ones. But certainly what people found were a lot of different ways to organize things. So again, talking about kinship systems, why did we orient our paper? Why do we have to start with it being in landscape mode or this way as opposed to this way? Yeah.
That in the way it is, like you have the trees, you're here, and then the siblings would be off to the side parallel, but like time wise, you can do how the upwards, you can't go back as far. So and
Most likely in your heads. Could anybody in their heads? I was already told that he couldn't go beyond his great grandparents, right? Could anybody go into great grandparents? 5? I think that's how many we got. Anybody go 4 or 5 generations deep in your heads? No, very difficult to keep that on our heads. And it's in part because of the system that we have, which is technically called a bilateral system. The reason we have to start like this is because it starts going out wide, because we believe that we are equally related to people on both of our parents' sides, that we're equally related to them. Now, that's not the only way to think about things. There are other societies in which you think of yourself as sort of more related, or what's more important are the people on one side or the other. Unilineal systems. So there's actually two main forms of unilineal systems. The patrilineal system, in which people would consider themselves mostly in terms of descent and perhaps in terms of the biological stuff, even that they are related to the people on their father's side. If you look at your charts, you probably have a little bit of patrilineality going on. Most of us do. Where do we see patrilineality in our charts? Well, that we just see we could see triangles in all kinds of places. How many last names do you have? Where did that name come from? Two. Why? In many Spanish speaking societies, you get your father's and mother's last name, and so you end up with four names. You got your first name, middle name, father's and mother's name, although eventually the mother's names do drop out in the next generation usually. And so, but there's a little bit of patrilineality for the most part in our charts. That's where for most of us, we get our last names. Sometimes that changes, and again, in some societies, that's a little different than in others. But we have a little bit of patrilineality there. That's patrilineality is something that is widespread in descent systems, but there are also some very significant, especially in the Americas, in the Indigenous society of the Americas, Native Americans, matrilineal systems, in which descent, inheritance, to a certain extent, the naming of people and the stuff that you would pass along is passed along the mother's line, the matrilineal system. And so this is not as common as patrilineal systems, but there are some pretty significant examples of matrilineal systems. If you were in a unilineal system, you would actually want to orient your page like this, because most people in unilineal systems can name back 5 or 6 generations easy, because it doesn't go out that far. You can go back, don't have to go out, don't have to worry about all those brothers, especially if they were on what? Your dad's side? Who cares? Not even related to them. No biggie. If you were in a matrilineal system, you wouldn't even bother with those. Write them all out of the family inheritance. So those are possibilities for reckoning kinship. All right. Now let's go back into the marriage stuff. We'll come back to this. The kinship stuff, of course, underlies our marriage things because of who you are able to and unable to marry and how people come together in these systems. But our first question is, Brady, one that you never thought you needed to ask, which is, what is marriage? Why do we need to know what marriage is?
So many different forms of marriages in different cultures, and it can mean something different to different people, so they have to find a common ground to be able to define.
Yeah, there's marriages all over the world, but what exactly it does and what exactly it is sometimes a little bit difficult to tell. So anthropologists in general look for a few things. Of course, this is one that we like, sanctioning sexual relationships, which is what we usually think of in terms of marriage. But in many societies, it can also be a division of labor. So what two people do in the household, and very importantly, legitimates the offspring, making sure that the people that are the offspring of this union are going to be sanctioned and part of the inheritance and part of the naming process. So marriage can do, or often does, many of these things. And since marriage does these things in society, it has often been about organizing a family's resource being able to pass things along legitimately as inheritance, and sometimes forming political alliances with different groups or different families across. And so if you read here, there's all kinds of ways in which Gonzalez talks about marriage as economic exchange, bride price and bride service, dowries, these kinds of things, which may seem a little strange to us because we don't think of marriage as an economic exchange, although we do still have some of those elements when usually it's the bride's family who are supposed to pay for the wedding, for example, is an outcome of a residue, you might say, of the dowry relationship. But these things come into place because oftentimes marriage has a lot to do with organizing your economic and political resources. And so, Lauren, marriage is about organizing all these resources. What do we have to do? What do we have to make sure? What do we often have to do in the olden days to make sure all this stuff stays in the right place? Arranged marriages, yes. You wouldn't want to leave this to chance. You don't want to have just goofy children going off and doing their goofy things. You'd have to arrange this thing. You got to get all your ducks in order. You got to have everything good to go. Nick, do we do this anymore anywhere?
Not really. On the Western Hemisphere, but more in the Eastern Hemisphere specifically. The example they gave in the book was in Mumbai, India. Arranged weddings are pretty common over there, and it's kind of like the standard way for young, educated, and middle-class women in India cities who become married.
Yeah, so arranged marriages are still around, and in some cases are actually gaining in popularity because they try out the love thing and find it's not so great. But our question obviously would be, what about love? Actually, Francis, is there any love in these arranged marriages?
Been to a few marriage weddings.
Oh yeah.
They are like so they can find the one random people, but they're still together.
They're still together. It worked. Yeah, the love thing is interesting. So the first thing I want to say is that love is something that is something that people all over the world talk about, and it's pretty close to a human universal. And it's people who participate in arranged marriages. They often talk about whether they do love each other at the beginning or if they will grow into that love over time. And so it's not that love is absent, but the idea that romantic love would be the basis for getting married, like the primary reason that you get married, would be seen in many places as totally nuts. Why would you do that? Because, well, how to say? Has anybody only ever been in love with somebody once? It's kind of something that, it's something that some people say that love is an emotion that helps us get out of relationships more than get into them, because we're always falling in love and like, oh, hey, I found somebody, I fell in love with them. Sorry, dude, I'm out. Romantic love is everybody knows that it's a little bit of a come and go kind of thing, and that you would base your marriage on it. No, that's not a good idea. And even in our own society, this is probably in the last 100 or 200 years. If you are a reader of, say, Jane Austen's novels, you'll see that it's coming into the landscape of English society in the last 200 years, but it's not really there yet. There's still a lot of arranged marriage and stuff going on there. So the idea that romantic love would be the basis for your marriage is relatively recent. Now, I'll say it's also relatively widespread now. People in Mumbai and everywhere think about love as a basis for marriage. And some people have decided that, better to do the arranged thing. Doing better on the arranged marriages. So there are other rules about marriage that we can think about. Pluto, you said you were surprised by all these terminologies, all these words that we started throwing out there. What are these? Exogamy and endogamy. What's that?
The partners from the same family line. And endogamy is like from a different.
Oh, yeah, these are tough terms. I think that endogamy is, how do I remember this? I don't even know how to remember it. Exogamy is outside, that you have to marry from outside your group, and endogamy is more inside. I don't know. Is there a good way to remember that? Exo, endo. Yeah, but you're on the right track. It's rules about how close you can marry or how far you should marry. And every society has different ideas about, okay, you need to marry somebody from your religion, social group. And every society has rules about, oh, wait, you can't marry somebody that's too close to you. Especially, Taylor, what happens if you marry somebody that's too close to you? Actually, this is what's that? Which is the incest taboo. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that. That's why it's called the incest taboo. And there's been a lot of different reasons proposed for why that is. Gonzalez plays up the biological reason a lot. I'm not sure it's as, I mean, certainly if you're going to be doing a lot of brother sister marriages, yeah, you're going to be in trouble. But the cousin stuff, not necessarily as genetically suspect as we might have once thought. This is also tricky. So basically, I'll say that in every society, there are rules about you can't marry too close. Can't be too close, not too endogamous, or else you run up against the incest taboo, the prohibitions on incest. But who it is that you will actually consider to be your close relatives varies from society to society. So on page 160, we have an example from Napoleon Chagnon. Yanomami people are encouraged to marry their cross cousins, the child of a parent's opposite sex sibling, such as the mother's brother, but are forbidden from marrying their parallel cousins. Wow. We don't think about things like this. We just think cousins. So let's think about this for a second. Here you are, a triangle, let's say. This would be cousins on your father's side. So your father's brother, especially if you lived in a patrilineal, let's say you're a triangle living in a patrilineal society. Your father's brother are going to be people that you would consider extremely related to you. And actually the same thing probably if you live in a patrilineal society for your cross cousins, your patrilateral cross cousins. But these people over here are actually not considered to be very related to you because they're from your mother's side. They're your matrilateral, especially your matrilateral cross cousins. They're like from a different lineage. So, good idea for being married. Get married to your matrilateral cross cousin. You can look on your kinship chart and figure out who that is. Don't want to? Why not, Seth? you'll leave it at that. It's actually not that, it's not that uncommon in the Anglo-speaking world. It's legal in at least 26 states, and the geneticists tell us it's not that iffy. You don't even have to get special genetic testing to marry a cousin.
Wait, really?
Really. I know. Feels kind of icky though. All right. Switch it up. Something that doesn't feel icky at all. Monogamy, polygamy. All right, monogamy we know and love, being married to one person, which is, as Gonzalez says, is the majority of marriages in most societies. So most societies actually, even if they permit other forms of marriage, most marriages are monogamous or married to one person. Polygamy, being married to more than one person at a time. Alicia, what's a form of polygamy that we learned about?
We have the polygyny and the polyandry. Polygyny is just when you're married to one or more wives, and polyandry is when you're married to four husbands, which is
Very rare. Okay, so polygyny, polygamy, no, is actually, in the majority of the world societies, is a permissible form. It doesn't constitute the majority of the marriages in those societies, because most of the time, in order to do it right, you have to have a lot of wealth or a lot of money. It often happens in places where there are issues where you need more labor. And so people in societies where labor and is prioritized, and people that are wealthy might see this as a kind of ideal. Mickey, you said that you thought polygyny was polygamy.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's I mean, it's part of it, but I thought that polygamy was polygamy. I thought it was.
Yeah, most of us think that in this United States, in part because it's more common. It is true that polyandry is one of the rarest forms of marriage as a formal marriage system. A woman being married to more than one husband, and it usually occurs as what we call fraternal polyandry. The of you who are in frats know, being married to several brothers. It's usually done in order to preserve land and resources within a family. For those of you who were with me over on that side of the room, just a few months ago, we learned about polyandry and we read about it. So it makes me a tiny bit sad, Mickey, that we did this very thing and you still thought polygamy was polygyny, because we already went through that. He wasn't paying attention. Aha, there we go. It's a tough lesson, so we have to learn it a few times. Now, this has come up. Sometimes people in our societies like to get down on people who permit polygyny because we say, you don't have stable marriages. But if we look at our own society, we would classify it, or people would say that we don't necessarily have monogamy as much as we have serial monogamy. That is to say, you're married to one person for a while, and then get married to another person for a while. Cycle keeps going. Things get complicated over time. We usually learn how to do this in college. Okay, so polygamy is actually, like I said, it's a difficult thing to pull off. You usually have to be pretty wealthy to pull it off. And so in some ways it's been diminished in today's world. It's sometimes difficult to pull off in a capitalist system. There are some people who say that polyandry may not have been as rare in the past and in other societies as as a system for gathering resources. But, that's, it's still, as a formal system of marriage, it's still pretty debatable. Another couple ways that we can talk about kinship and marriage and family. Gonzalez talks to us about the nuclear family, the form that is most familiar to us. And so this is a couple, parents and children, and that this, or one of the ideals in the United States, is to have a neo-local family. That is to say, when people get married, they're supposed to be able to have their own house, go live in a new place, neo-local, which means new locality. However, this is not, well, even in the United States, it's not the majority of the ways that people are living today. And in other parts of the world, extended families are extremely important. So families that incorporate more members than just the parents and the children. Gonzalez mentions a couple types, one of them being matrilineal societies or residents, in which the male leaves the residence of his family and goes and lives with the wife's family, or patrilineal, where the woman leaves her kin and goes to live with the husband's family. And so this forms a larger family unit. These can be quite flexible and interesting in ways in which they mobilize resources and are able to help each other. They can also be places of tension and create new issues or new problems. So there's all kinds of different ways that we do marriages and families and love and arrangements and all of those things. When we're describing sometimes different societies, we like to talk about these terms that we talked about, like, they're endogamous by religion or endogamous by caste, or they have to be exogamous by tribe. But if we turn our attention back to the United States, we believe, of course, that we marry for love. We have free will and love, and we choose who we want to get married to, and nothing's going to stop us from getting married to the love of our life. But if you look statistically at who marries whom in the United States, we are often very endogamous. Well, guess what we are endogamous in terms of? Yes, social class. We are very endogamous in terms of social class. Certainly, sometimes people marry people outside of their social class. Sometimes working class marries somebody who's rich, and sometimes rich marry a middle class person. But for the most part, social class structures our expectations of who we're going to marry. And if you try sometime bringing home somebody to dinner of a different social class to your parents and see how you all get along. I mean, the way we hold forks and knives and what we're going to serve at what time, what we're going to have to drink, how much Mountain Dew we're going to have at dinner. It's all very, it becomes very embodied. Now, the question, though, is how do we keep up our belief in love and that we're just marrying for love, but at the same time, make sure that people basically marry people in the same social class? Liam's already been through this. He remembers that day. All right, Liam, how do we do it?
This is described how, most of the time, social classes don't generally interact with each other and for long periods of time in the way to form one of these relationships. So when it comes down to it, you're gonna interact with people that are within your class. You go to work every day. You go to working class people, you don't really see your CEO all the time. That kind of thing.
We are very geographically stratified. So a lot of this has to do with where we grow up and where we live. And we're very stratified. A part of it has to do with house values and how much house you can afford in different places and who can even live in a community. If it's a $5 million house, then you got to have a $5 million job, right? If you're living here in Oneonta, yeah, you can meet people of all backgrounds here. So part of it has to do with our zip code, but Liam's done this one too. Maybe somebody else should try except Liam. How do we do this? How do we get people together from different places? Let me give you an example. I was originally raised in Montana, a very far away zip code, 59853. And my wife was originally raised in New Jersey. Oh, I don't even remember that zip code. Who knows? Who knows? How is it that people from very different zip codes come together, get married to each other? College, yes, college. That's right. One of the great ways to sort people out. And the thing is that most people go to a college that is in their own social class. And the way we do that is because of SAT scores and stuff like that, which often almost perfectly correlate to wealth in this country. So, you end up with these people from, although my wife and I were from very different zip codes, ethnicities, backgrounds, same social class, because hey, we're in the same college. So this happens to us. It's a great social sorting. And of course, the people who don't go to college are still in their zip code. So we can still fall in love with the right people, making sure that everybody marries endogamously. All right. Actually, I'm going to skip the next part because it's too sad. Did have this dog, though. I want to go back to sort of the main lessons that we learned from the anthropology of kinship. So back in the days, what we thought and what some people still believe is that, everything corresponds to biology, that, in more advanced societies, you're going to be more monogamous. And so basically, my idea about this is that all of that the great array of things that anthropologists have found out about all the different ways that people can marry and love and have kin with each other is wonderful for fighting these ethnocentric ideas that we have and deterministic ideas. There's only one way to do things in life. What I think gets us sometimes into trouble, though, is if that idea of kinship determination becomes a new form of determinism. That is to say, aha, I know why people in that society aren't working very much. It's because of their endogamous, polygamous relationships that they have, right? And so this idea that somehow your whole life is going to be determined by kinship relations and these sort of ideas about families or residents, we have to be careful that it doesn't become a new way to form our opinions about other societies. So